Olivia Carter and Ethan Calloway were born into privilege. Their lives intertwined long before they could understand what it meant. Their families moved in the same elite circles of New York City, their names etched into the foundations of business empires and old money legacies. But despite the wealth, the prestige, and the carefully laid plans of generations before them, Olivia and Ethan found solace in something far simpler: each other. From the moment they could walk, they were inseparable. Olivia, a whirlwind of energy with an artist's heart, would drag Ethan across the sprawling gardens of their family's estates, her laughter ringing through the marble halls as she dared him to keep up. Ethan, quieter and more deliberate, was always a step behind, watching, waiting, ready to catch her when she inevitably tumbled. Their childhood was filled with grand adventures, most of them make-believe. They were pirates, discovering hidden treasures in the vast libraries of their parents' mansions. They were astronauts, exploring the unknown depths of the backyard garden, searching for planets among the towering hedges. On rainy days, they'd sit side by side in Ethan's father's study, Olivia sketching extravagant dresses in the margins of her notebooks, while Ethan meticulously built entire cities out of wooden blocks. Their families often joked about their bond. At lavish dinner parties, where crystal chandeliers cast golden light over long mahogany tables, their parents would exchange knowing glances. "They'll end up together," Olivia's mother would say with an amused smile, watching as Olivia tugged Ethan away from yet another stiff conversation with an overly eager adult. Ethan's father would nod, sipping his whiskey. "It's inevitable." But for Olivia and Ethan, it was never about expectation. Their connection was effortless, built on laughter, trust, and the unspoken understanding that no matter where life took them, they would always find their way back to each other. By the time they turned 10, their friendship had become a world of its own. Olivia's fierce independence clashed with Ethan's careful logic, but their differences never pushed them apart. Instead, they balanced each other. When Olivia's wild ideas threatened to spiral into chaos, Ethan was the steady hand that guided them into something tangible. And when Ethan hesitated, afraid to step outside his meticulously planned comfort zone, Olivia was the force that pulled him forward, eyes bright with possibility. Of course, they fought. Olivia's stubborn streak was legendary, and Ethan's patience, though vast, had its limits. There were moments when their arguments flared, when Olivia's temper got the best of her and Ethan's quiet resolve turned to cold distance. But the fights never lasted. They knew each other too well, cared too much to let their differences keep them apart. It was always Olivia who caved first, creeping back into Ethan's room late at night, whispering an apology into the quiet, and Ethan, without fail, would sigh, roll his eyes, and say, "I was waiting for you." As the years passed, the world around them changed, but they remained constant. They grew older, taller, their features sharpening into something more defined, their laughter taking on a different weight. Ethan became more confident, his quiet nature developing into something deliberate, strong. Olivia, always bold, became even more so, her creativity no longer just playful sketches, but the foundation of something real, something brilliant. And yet, through it all, they were still Olivia and Ethan, the boy who thought too much and the girl who never thought enough, the dreamer and the planner, the dreamer and the planner, the fire and the steady ground beneath it. No one was surprised when, at 16, something shifted between them. It wasn't a sudden change, not a single moment where everything clicked into place. It was gradual, an accumulation of small glances held a little too long, of fingertips brushing against each other and lingering. It was Olivia catching herself watching Ethan when he wasn't looking, her heart stuttering for reasons she didn't quite understand. It was Ethan noticing the way Olivia's nose crinkled when she laughed and realizing that it was, without a doubt, his favorite sound in the world. Their classmates noticed before they did, teasing them mercilessly. "Just admit it already, Maya Brooks," Olivia's best friend, had laughed one afternoon, watching as Olivia and Ethan fell into their usual rhythm, arguing over something neither of them would remember by the next day. They denied it, of course, but deep down, they both knew the truth. One evening, after a long day of studying, they found themselves on the rooftop of Olivia's house, the sky painted in shades of pink and gold as the sun dipped below the horizon. The city stretched out before them, alive and endless. Olivia, uncharacteristically quiet, traced patterns into the concrete, her fingers absent-minded. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she asked, "Do you ever wonder what if we were more than this?" Ethan turned to her, his brow furrowing. "More than what?" She hesitated, then gestured between them. "This." His heart pounded, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had thought about it. Of course he had. But saying it out loud felt like crossing a line they could never uncross. Still, he found himself answering, "Yeah, I do." Whatever Olivia saw in his face made her smile. Soft, uncertain, but full of something unspoken. And before either of them could think too much, she leaned in, pressing the lightest, briefest kiss to his lips. In that moment, everything changed. Ethan sat frozen, his mind struggling to catch up with reality. Olivia had just kissed him. It was light, fleeting, nothing more than a whisper against his lips, but it was enough to shift the entire axis of his world. She pulled back just a fraction, her face so close that he could still feel the warmth of her breath. Her dark eyes searched his, looking for something. Reassurance, regret, maybe even an answer to a question. Neither even an answer to a question neither of them had dared ask until now. His heart pounded in his chest, a rhythmic, thunderous beat that drowned out the sounds of the city below. For years, Olivia had been his best friend, his partner in everything, the one person who knew him better than anyone. And yet, in that moment, she felt like something entirely new. Someone he had always known but had never truly seen. She started to pull away, her usual confidence flickering just slightly at the edges. "Ethan," she began, but he didn't let her finish. Before doubt could creep in, before she could guess herself, he reached for her, cupping her face in his hands. And then he kissed her back. This time, it wasn't fleeting. It wasn't tentative. It was certainty. It was years of unspoken thoughts, of unnoticed moments, of something that had always been there, waiting just beneath the surface. Olivia let out a soft, surprised sound against his lips before melting into him, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt as if anchoring herself. When they finally broke apart, breathless, Ethan kept his forehead resting against hers. "So," he murmured, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth that was unexpected. Olivia let out a shaky laugh, her hands still clutching at him. "Was it?" Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "No," he admitted, voice softer now. "Not really." Silence settled between them, but it wasn't awkward. It was thick with something new, something neither of them had words for yet. "Does this mean we're—" Olivia gestured between them. Ethan grinned. "You kissed me first, Carter. That means you have to define it." She rolled her eyes but didn't let go of him. "Fine," she said, tilting her chin up. "We're dating now." The words sent a thrill through him, ridiculous and exhilarating all at once. He had thought about this before, of course. He had wondered, imagined, but hearing her say it, real, undeniable, made it feel different. "Okay," he said, his grin widening. "I can live with that." For a while, nothing changed. They were still Olivia and Ethan, still best friends who stole each other's food and argued over movies and stayed up way too late talking about things that didn't matter. But at the same time, everything changed. The first time Ethan reached for Olivia's hand in the middle of the school hallway, she smirked at him but didn't pull away. The first time she kissed him in front of their friends, Mia let out a dramatic cheer, and Ethan swore he'd never seen Olivia look more pleased with herself. The first time he whispered, "I love you," it wasn't some grand declaration. It was quiet, in the middle of the night, as she was half asleep on his shoulder, mumbling something about how the stars looked lonelier than usual. But it didn't need to be grand. She just smiled against his skin and whispered, "I love you too." Not everyone believed they would last. People said teenage love was fleeting, that first loves never lasted forever. Teachers gave them knowing smiles, as if waiting for the inevitable heartbreak. Their parents, while supportive, offered gentle warnings, reminding them that life had a way of pulling people apart. But Olivia and Ethan didn't listen. They planned for the future, not just as individuals, but as a unit. When Olivia talked about moving to New York to study fashion, Ethan was already looking at architecture programs nearby. When Ethan spoke about the kind of buildings he wanted to design, Olivia would start sketching outfits inspired by them. "We make a good team," Olivia said one night, curled up next to him as they stared at the city skyline. Ethan pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "We always have." By the time graduation rolled around, they had defied every whispered prediction of their inevitable breakup. They had made it, and they weren't going anywhere. So when they both got accepted into schools in the same city, it felt like fate was sealing their path. A promise whispered in childhood, a bond forged in years of trust, a love that had grown between them like something steady and unshakable. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have possibly known, was how much that love would be tested. Moving to the city felt like the beginning of everything they had been working toward. New York was fast, alive, pulsing with ambition and endless possibility. Ethan thrived in the rigid, disciplined world of architecture, while Olivia threw herself into the chaos of fashion. Their schedules were brutal, their workloads relentless, but they carved out time for each other in the inn, between moments. Early morning coffee, runs before classes, late-night takeout on the fire escape of Olivia's apartment, stolen weekends where they pretended the world didn't exist outside of them. Despite their growing responsibilities, their love remained the constant. Ethan would sit in the back of Olivia's fashion lectures, sketching blueprints, while she furiously scribbled designs beside him. She would curl up on the couch of his studio, flipping through fabric samples while he refined models of soaring skyscrapers. Their dreams, though different, always seemed to fit together like two pieces of the same puzzle. But it wasn't always easy. College was an entirely different battlefield, one that demanded their full attention. Ethan's professors pushed him harder than ever before, drilling into him the expectations that came with carrying the Callaway name. He spent sleepless nights perfecting structural designs, chasing the kind of innovation that would set him apart. Olivia, on the other hand, had to fight for every inch of space in an industry that thrived on exclusivity. She wasn't just another student with a dream. She was a force to be reckoned with, designing bold, unapologetic pieces that caught the attention of people far beyond the classroom. But recognition came with a price. Their schedules began to pull them in different directions. Some nights Ethan would come home to find Olivia passed out over her sewing machine, her fingers ink, stained from last-minute adjustments. Other nights, Olivia would wake up alone in bed, Ethan still at the studio, lost in the world of blueprints and calculations. Their love was still there, strong, unwavering, but it was tested in ways they hadn't anticipated. One night, after an especially grueling week, Ethan found Olivia on their fire escape, staring down at the city. The exhaustion in her eyes mirrored his own. He sat beside her, letting the silence settle between them, before he finally asked, "Are we okay?" She exhaled, running a hand through her messy hair. "I don't know," she admitted. "I love you, Ethan." But sometimes it feels like we're just surviving. His stomach twisted at her words, at the honesty in them. We knew this wasn't going to be easy. I know, she said softly, turning to face him. But what happens if we get so caught up in everything else that we forget about us? Ethan didn't have an answer. But despite the doubts, despite the exhaustion, neither of them was willing to give up. They adjusted, learned to navigate the chaos. They made rules. No work talk during dinner. No skipping their Sunday mornings together. No letting stress pull them apart. Slowly, they found their rhythm again. By their junior year, everything started falling into place. Ethan secured an internship at one of the top architectural firms in the country, his designs earning him a reputation as a rising star. Olivia's clothing line gained traction, her bold designs attracting the attention of high-profile fashion influencers. They were making a name for themselves, carving out the futures they had always dreamed of. One evening, as they lay tangled together in Olivia's tiny apartment, she whispered, "I don't want to lose us." Ethan brushed a kiss against her forehead. "You won't." She pulled back just enough to search his face. "Promise." He smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Promise." They believed it. They had fought through the hardest parts. Their love had survived distance, exhaustion, ambition. Nothing could break them. But they had no idea how much more their love would be tested. Ethan had been carrying the ring for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment. He had envisioned countless ways to ask Olivia, extravagant proposals, intimate ones, something grand, something quiet. But every time he tried to settle on a plan, none of them felt quite right. Their love had never been about flashy displays or carefully orchestrated moments. It had been built in the stolen minutes between their chaotic lives, in the whispered reassurances and unwavering support. It had always been about them. So when Olivia mentioned wanting to take a trip, just the two of them, away from the demands of the city, Ethan knew this was it. He suggested Hawaii, a place she had always dreamed of visiting, and booked the flights before she could change her mind. The moment they arrived, it felt like a different world. They stayed in a secluded eco-lodge nestled between the cliffs and the sea, where the morning smelled like salt and hibiscus, and the nights were drenched in starlight. Olivia was radiant here, barefoot on the sand, her hair tousled by the breeze, sketching new designs on napkins as they sipped cocktails by the shore. Ethan watched her with quiet admiration, his heart swelling with every laugh, every careless brush of her fingers against his. He had always known she was his future. He had always known she was his future. He had never doubted that. But watching her here, surrounded by endless horizons and golden sunlight, he felt it in his bones. On their fourth evening, he set his plan in motion. He arranged a private dinner on a terrace overlooking the ocean. Candlelight flickering in the warm breeze, the sound of waves crashing below them. Olivia was lost in conversation, animatedly describing the new direction she wanted to take with her designs, completely unaware of the way Ethan's fingers curled around the small velvet box in his pocket. He listened, soaking in the passion in her voice, the fire in her eyes, before finally interrupting her with a soft "Olivia." She paused, tilting her head. "Yeah." His pulse thundered in his ears, but his voice remained steady. "I've loved you for as long as I can remember." Her lips parted slightly, her expression shifting as realization dawned. Ethan pulled the box from his pocket and slowly dropped to one knee. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want you in it. I know that no matter where life takes us, you're the person I want by my side." His voice was thick with emotion, but he didn't waver. "Marry me, Olivia." For the first time in her life, Olivia was speechless. Her eyes darted between the ring, an elegant design he had custom-made, blending modern beauty with intricate patterns inspired by her love of heritage. And the man kneeling before her, the man kneeling before her, the man who had been her best friend, her partner, her everything. Her chest tightened with an overwhelming rush of emotions. "I'm not rushing you," Ethan added softly. "Whether it's now, a year from now, 5 years from now, I'll wait, you well know that. But I want you to know that no matter when you're ready, I will be too." Tears burned at the corners of her eyes. There had never been a moment in her life where she had been more sure of something. A trembling laugh escaped her lips as she whispered, "Yes." Then, louder, firmer, as joy overtook her, 1,000 times. "Yes." The world around them melted away as Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger, his hand steady despite the storm of emotions surging through him. The moment she was his, truly his, he pulled her into his arms, their lips meeting in a kiss that tasted of salt and stardust and promises made under endless skies. That night, as they lay in bed, fingers entwined, they spoke about their future, their wedding, the places they would go, the life they would build. They had no idea how much of it would be stolen from them. The excitement of their engagement followed them back to New York, where the news spread like wildfire among their friends and family. Messages poured in, celebrations were planned, and suddenly their love story became something bigger than just the two of them. Their parents, especially Olivia's father, Jonathan Carter, were quick to take charge, steering the wedding planning into something grander than either of them had imagined. At first, Olivia was swept up in the whirlwind of it all. The venue scouting, the dress fittings, the endless conversations about flowers, seating charts, and dinner menus. Ethan, though far less invested in the details, was happy to let Olivia take the lead, content just knowing that in the end, she would be walking down the aisle toward him. But not everything was as effortless as they had hoped. Jonathan Carter had always been a force of nature, a man who built empires, shaped industries, and expected his daughter to do the same. He had never been the type to simply let things unfold without his influence, and Ethan had always known that earning his approval was going to be an uphill battle. The first sign of trouble came during an otherwise ordinary evening when Jonathan invited Ethan to his office under the pretense of discussing wedding logistics. The room was lined with floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a sweeping view of the city, a kingdom Jonathan had spent decades building. Ethan stood tall, meeting the older man's assessing gaze. Jonathan took his time, swirling the whiskey in his glass before finally speaking. "You're a talented young man, Ethan. Smart, ambitious. But let's not pretend we don't know what's at stake here." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I don't see this as a transaction, sir. I love Olivia. That's all there is to it." Jonathan let out a dry chuckle. "That's where you're wrong. Love is never all there is to it." He leaned forward, placing the glass down with a soft clink. "Olivia is special. She has a future that extends beyond being someone's wife. She was never meant to be tethered down." Ethan's fingers curled into fists, but he kept his voice even. "I would never hold her back. We support each other. We always have." Jonathan studied him for a long moment before exhaling. "Then tell me this. What happens when your careers pull you in opposite directions, when her dreams take her across the world, and yours keep you tied to a city skyline?" Ethan had no answer for that. Not because he hadn't thought about it, but because the idea of Olivia not being by his side wasn't something he was willing to accept. Jonathan sat back, satisfied with the silence. "You seem like a good man, Ethan. But my daughter was never meant for an ordinary life." Ethan left that conversation with his hands clenched and his mind restless. He didn't tell Olivia about it. He didn't want to start a fight, didn't want to let Jonathan's words plant doubt where there was none. But they lingered anyway, a quiet, gnawing weight at the back of his mind. Olivia, on the other hand, was too caught up in the chaos of planning to notice Ethan's unease. The wedding had become something of an event, growing larger with each passing day. Every decision felt monumental, every expectation weighing heavier on her shoulders. One evening, exhausted from a never-ending call with a wedding planner, she collapsed onto the couch beside Ethan, sighing dramatically. "Tell me again why people willingly do this." Ethan chuckled, pulling her close. "Because they love each other?" She groaned. "Yeah, well, I love you. But if one more person asks me about floral arrangements, I might actually lose my mind." He kissed the top of her head, a smile tugging at his lips, despite the lingering thoughts in his mind. "Then, forget about all of it for a second. Just think about the moment when you're walking down that aisle. Everything else disappears." She let out a breath, her body relaxing against him. "That's the only part I actually care about." And for that moment, it was enough. But underneath it all, there were fractures, small, barely noticeable cracks forming beneath the surface. The pressure, the expectations, the whispered warnings. Neither of them knew just how much those cracks would widen before the wedding even began. The morning of their wedding arrived with the kind of golden light that belonged in fairy tales. The estate they had chosen sat atop a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean, where waves crashed against the rocks in a steady, rhythmic pulse, as if nature itself was breathing in anticipation. White roses draped the grand courtyard, their scent mingling with the salty breeze, while hundreds of guests took their seats beneath a canopy of soft linen and crystal chandeliers that swayed gently overhead. Inside the bridal suite, Olivia stood in front of an ornate mirror, staring at her reflection as her mother adjusted the delicate lace veil cascading down her back. The gown was a masterpiece, custom, designed, every intricate bead and stitch woven with intention, merging the legacy of her heritage with the bold, modern artistry she had built for herself. But as breathtaking as she looked, the true weight of the moment settled in only when her mother's hands stilled on her shoulders. "You're really doing this," her mother whispered, voice thick with emotion. Olivia swallowed past the lump in her throat, nodding. "I am." A soft knock on the door interrupted them, and Maya peeked her head in, grinning. "They're ready for you." In another part of the estate, Ethan stood in front of his own reflection, adjusting the crisp ivory lapels of his suit. He was no stranger to pressure. He had presented architectural designs to rooms full of critics, defended projects worth millions. But nothing had ever made his heart pound the way it did now. Not out of fear, but of certainty. "You good?" his best man, Caleb, asked from behind him. Ethan exhaled a slow breath and met his friend's gaze in the mirror. "Never been more sure of anything." Caleb smirked.
"Good. Because if you left Olivia at the altar, she'd hunt you down herself."
Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "Not a chance." The music began to swell outside, signaling the start of the ceremony. Guests quieted, anticipation thick in the air. Then the doors swung open. For a moment, Ethan forgot how to breathe. Olivia stepped into the golden light, a vision of elegance and strength. Every detail of the venue, every carefully planned moment, faded into insignificance as she walked toward him. Her dark eyes locked onto his, and in them he saw everything. Every late-night conversation, every whispered promise, every version of their future they had imagined together. Time slowed. This was it. When she reached him, her father gave Ethan a lingering, unreadable look before handing her over. The ceremony unfolded like something out of a dream. Their vows weren't just words. They were a culmination of everything they had been through, a promise forged from years of love, ambition, and unshakable devotion. "I choose you," Olivia whispered, her fingers trembling slightly as she slipped the ring onto his hand. Ethan's voice was steady as he answered, "And I will always choose you." The moment their lips met, the world erupted into cheers. The night that followed was a blur of laughter, music, and endless celebration. The reception was held inside a breathtaking glass pavilion, where chandeliers glittered overhead and the ocean reflected in the mirrored walls. Every toast, every dance, every lingering glance between them felt like a moment stolen from eternity. And yet, even in the midst of joy, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. He caught Jonathan Carter watching him from across the room, his expression unreadable. A chill ran down Ethan's spine, but then Olivia found his hand, squeezing it gently, grounding him. And just like that, the world righted itself again. They had made it. They had no idea that before the night was over, their world would shatter completely. The reception was everything they had dreamed of, elegant yet filled with warmth, grand but undeniably theirs. Laughter echoed through the glass pavilion. Champagne flutes clinked together in celebration, and the dance floor pulsed with life as guests swayed beneath the glittering chandeliers. Olivia and Ethan had barely spent a moment apart, hands constantly finding each other, lips brushing in stolen kisses between conversations and toasts. Then, near the end of the night, Olivia's father stepped forward, signaling for attention. A hush fell over the room as he lifted his glass, his expression unreadable. "Tonight is not just about a wedding," Jonathan Carter said, his voice smooth, practiced. "It is about legacy, about two extraordinary people coming together to build something far greater than themselves. Olivia, my daughter, my pride. You have always defied expectations, and Ethan, you have shown the kind of unwavering dedication that proves you are worthy of her." Ethan felt Olivia stiffen beside him at the word worthy, but she didn't say anything. She simply squeezed his hand. Jonathan gestured toward the grand doors leading out to the terrace. "And so, as a gift to the both of you, I have arranged something unforgettable." The doors swung open, revealing the estate's private helipad. Sitting there, sleek and gleaming under the moonlight, was a black and gold helicopter. Excited murmurs rippled through the crowd. Olivia turned to her father, eyes wide. "Dad, what is this?" Jonathan smiled. "A chance to start your new life with an unforgettable night. A private flight along the coastline, just the two of you. A moment of peace before you return to the world waiting for you." Gasps of admiration spread through the guests. Ethan saw the way Olivia's lips parted in surprise, her gaze flickering between the helicopter and her father. He leaned in, whispering, "We don't have to." But Olivia shook her head, smiling. "No, this is incredible." She turned back to Jonathan, her voice softening. Her father placed a firm hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Take care of her." The weight of those words settled heavily between them. Then, with the cheers of their guests ringing in their ears, Olivia and Ethan climbed into the helicopter, the doors shutting behind them with a final, decisive click. The rotor blades spun to life, kicking up a gust of wind as the aircraft lifted off the ground, carrying them high above the estate. Below, the pavilion and the glittering celebration shrank into something small, distant. Olivia let out a breathless laugh, watching as the coastline stretched before them, a ribbon of gold and black against the vast, endless sea. "This is unreal," she murmured, leaning her head on Ethan's shoulder. He pressed a kiss to her hair, his grip tightened around her hand. "Not as unreal as marrying you." She laughed, tilting her head up to kiss him. "And for a while, everything was perfect." Then, the first jolt. Ethan barely had time to process it before another one hit. sharper this time. The helicopter lurched to the side. Olivia's breath hitched, her fingers digging into his arm. "What was that?" she asked, her voice tight. The pilot's voice came through their headsets, calm but firm. "Just some unexpected turbulence. Nothing to worry about." Ethan wasn't convinced. Another jolt. This time, the aircraft shuddered. A red warning light flashed on the control panel, then another. A sharp beeping filled the cockpit. The pilot cursed under his breath. "Hold on." The words barely left his lips before the helicopter dropped. Olivia screamed. Ethan's arms went around her instinctively, pulling her close as the world tilted. The coastline spun outside the windows, sky and sea blending into a sickening blur. The radio crackled with static. The alarms wailed. "We're losing control," the pilot shouted. "System failure." A deafening snap. Then they were falling. The world spun violently, gravity shifting as the helicopter plummeted. The sickening lurch of free fall sent Olivia's stomach flipping, her scream ripped away by the deafening roar of wind and metal groaning under unbearable strain. Ethan's arms wrapped around her, his grip unyielding, as if sheer willpower alone could hold her safe. Through the chaos, she caught a glimpse of the pilot, his face tight with fear, hands gripping the controls in a desperate attempt to stabilize the failing craft. "We're going down," he shouted, his voice barely cutting through the shrieking alarms. The control panel flickered violently, blinking red lights, warning sirens, a cacophony of system failures all screaming the same grim truth. They were out of time. A violent jerk sent them spinning sideways. The ocean, which had been a distant shimmer, was now an unavoidable force beneath them, its dark waves crashing hungrily against jagged cliffs. The helicopter tilted, momentum dragging them dangerously close to the rocky shoreline. Ethan's voice cut through the panic, firm and unwavering. "Olivia, look at me." She turned her head, her vision blurring, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "I've got you," he swore, pressing his forehead to hers for the briefest second. "No matter what happens, I won't let go." A piercing crack rang out. The tail rotor snapped, sending them into a death spiral. The helicopter careened wildly, slamming against a craggy rock face before bouncing off with a sickening jolt. Olivia barely registered the impact. Her head snapped back, pain exploding through her skull as the world whited out. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no motion. Then, agony. Her senses came rushing back in shards of pain and confusion. Smoke. Heat. Somewhere in the distance, the screeching of metal against rock filled the air. The wreckage shifted, groaning under its own weight, threatening to collapse entirely. A sharp cough ripped from her throat as she struggled to move.
"Where was Ethan?"
"Ethan," she croaked, her voice barely above a whisper. A low groan answered her. She twisted toward the sound, her body screaming in protest, vision swimming. There. He was slumped against the shattered remains of his seat, his white wedding suit torn and smeared with blood and soot. His chest rose and fell unevenly, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. Panic clawed at her ribs. "Ethan," she tried again, reaching for him. Every movement sent a fresh wave of agony through her battered limbs, but she pushed through it. She had to get to him. The wreckage lurched. A chilling realization dawned. The helicopter was teetering on the edge of the cliff. Half of it was precariously balanced against jagged rocks, the other half dangling over the vast, roaring sea below. And it was slipping. Her heart slammed against her ribs. "Ethan, wake up," she pleaded, shaking him with all the strength she had left. His eyelids fluttered, a soft, pained sound escaping his lips. His fingers twitched against the torn fabric of his sleeve. "Live." His voice was hoarse, barely audible. Tears burned at her eyes. Relief, terror, love, all of it tangled into something unbearable. "You're okay," she whispered, even though he clearly wasn't, even though none of this was okay. A violent creak echoed through the night. The wreckage shifted again, sliding, groaning, surrendering to gravity's pull. They had seconds. With adrenaline surging, Olivia hooked her arm under Ethan's shoulders and pulled. Every inch felt impossible. Every motion sent fresh agony lacing through her body, but she gritted her teeth and kept going. Behind them, the remaining structure gave one final, tortured groan. Then, it collapsed. The wreckage broke apart, plummeting down the cliffside in a burst of fire and metal. The explosion's force tore them away from the edge, sending them rolling onto the uneven, jagged rocks. Olivia landed hard, her body screaming in pain, but she didn't stop. She crawled to Ethan, pressing trembling fingers to his chest, still breathing. Far below, in the dark abyss of the sea, the last remnants of their wedding night burned. And somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed. Help was coming. But Olivia wasn't sure if it would be soon enough. The night air was thick with smoke and salt, a suffocating mixture that burned Olivia's lungs as she gasped for breath. Every nerve in her body screamed in pain, but she couldn't focus on herself. Not when Ethan lay motionless beside her, his breaths coming in uneven, shallow gasps. Her trembling fingers brushed his cheek, smearing away soot and blood. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely holding together. His eyelids fluttered, a flicker of consciousness returning, but he didn't have the strength to fully open his eyes. Somewhere in the distance, sirens pierced the stillness of night, but they were too far, too slow. She forced herself up onto shaking arms, the rocks beneath her slick with salt water and something darker. Her body protested every movement, but she had no choice. She had to move. The wreckage still burned behind them, flames licking hungrily at the remains of what was once a luxury helicopter. Sparks flared from exposed wires, casting eerie shadows across the cliffside. The ground beneath them was unstable, crumbling, breaking apart inch by inch. They couldn't stay here. Summoning every last shred of strength, Olivia tried to lift Ethan, hooking her arms beneath his shoulders. He let out a faint, pained groan, his body heavy, unresponsive. "I know," she choked out. "I know it hurts, but you have to hold on." Ethan's fingers twitched against the tattered remains of her dress. His lips parted, voice barely audible. "I'm here," she swore. "I'm not leaving you." But time was running out. Another violent tremor rippled through the cliffside, a deep, guttural groan of rock, shifting beneath the weight of destruction. Cracks split through the ground, sending loose debris tumbling into the abyss below. Olivia's pulse roared in her ears. They had to move. Now. With every ounce of strength left in her battered body, she pulled Ethan toward the edge of the collapsing ridge, toward the only solid ground she could see. Her feet slipped, raw hands scraping against the jagged terrain as she fought for balance. The world around her narrowed to one singular goal: get Ethan to safety. Then, a sickening snap. The earth beneath them gave way. The rocks beneath Ethan's body crumbled, disintegrating into nothingness. For one agonizing second, Olivia felt him slip. Her heart stopped. No, no, no. Instinct took over. She lunged, her fingers locking around his wrist, just as the cliffside collapsed beneath him. Ethan's body dangled over the void. The only thing keeping him from plummeting into the churning black sea was her grip. His eyes, dazed and barely focused, found hers. Liv. She would not let him go. Olivia's entire body burned with the strain of holding him, her muscles screaming in protest. Blood from a cut on her forehead trickled down into her eyes, blurring her vision, but she refused to blink. Ethan was slipping. Her grip was weakening. Terror clawed at her throat. Ethan, you have to help me. Please. Hold on. But he was barely conscious, his body too heavy, his injuries too severe. Her own fingers were wet with blood and sweat, her grip failing. No, no, no. This wasn't happening. A sob tore from her throat as she fought against the inevitable. The sound of sirens was louder now, the flashing red and blue lights casting chaotic reflections against the wreckage. They were so close. "Help!" Olivia screamed into the night, voice raw and desperate. "Help!" But there was no one close enough. No one but her. Ethan's lips barely moved, but she heard it. A whisper of her name, soft as the wind. Then, his fingers slipped. Olivia let out a shattered scream as his weight yanked her forward. For one moment, she thought she would go over with him. But then, a hand grabbed the back of her dress. A rescuer. Strong hand pulled her back, anchoring her to solid ground. But Ethan was gone. His body plummeted, disappearing into the darkness below. A splash, a deafening, gut-wrenching crash as his body struck the water. And then, nothing. The sirens wailed. The flames still crackled. The world still spun. But Olivia felt nothing. Because in that moment, her heart, her entire world, fell with him. The moment Ethan slipped from her grasp, the world stopped. Olivia's scream tore through the night, raw and filled with the kind of agony that shattered the very fabric of reality. She lurched forward, reaching, grasping, desperate, but it was too late. His body plummeted into the churning black sea below, swallowed whole by the abyss. The sharp crack of water against flesh rang out in the silence that followed, a sound so final, so devastating that Olivia couldn't breathe. Strong arms wrapped around her, yanking her back from the cliff's crumbling edge. "We've got you," a voice assured her. But it was distant, meaningless, empty. They didn't have him. Her body went limp in their grip, her pulse roaring in her ears. Ethan was down there, in the freezing water, alone, hurt. And she was up here. No. The word ripped from her throat as she fought against the arms holding her. She had to go after him. She had to... Olivia, stop. Another voice. Caleb. He was suddenly there, kneeling in front of her, his face ashen, frantic. They'll find him. The rescue team. They're too slow. She sobbed, clawing at the hands restraining her, trying to break free, trying to throw herself over the edge if it meant getting to Ethan. She didn't care about the pain tearing through her body, the blood soaking into her dress, the way her limbs screamed in protest. None of it mattered. All that mattered was Ethan. Somewhere behind her, voices shouted. Flashlights cut through the darkness. More rescuers were scaling the cliffside, lowering themselves toward the raging sea where the wreckage burned. "He's down there," Olivia screamed at them, her voice ragged and broken. "Find him!" They were already moving, already searching, but it wasn't fast enough. The minutes stretched into eternity. The air was filled with radio chatter, the hiss of flames, the crash of waves. Then, a voice cut through the noise. "We've got a body." The world lurched. Olivia's vision blurred as she shoved away from the rescuers, stumbling toward the edge. A light flickered below. Movement. A figure was being pulled from the water, soaked, lifeless, unmoving. She let out a shuddering sob as they hoisted him onto the rocks. His suit was shredded, blood staining his once pristine white shirt. His dark hair was matted to his forehead, skin pale beneath the flickering flames. "Ethan." She collapsed forward, hands caught her before she could reach him. "Let them work," someone said, but she barely registered who. She watched, helpless, terrified, barely breathing. As paramedics rushed around him, their voices sharp, urgent. One of them pressed fingers to Ethan's throat. Another tilted his head back, checked his breathing. The moment stretched, unbearable. Then, one of the medics shook his head. No pulse. Olivia's lungs seized. No, no, no. They started key P. The rhythmic pressure of hands against Ethan's chest was too slow, too controlled, too detached from the storm of panic raging inside Olivia's head. Her knees buckled. The hands holding her up were the only thing keeping her from collapsing completely. "Come back," she whispered, voice barely audible. "Ethan, come back." Another round of compressions, another breath forced into his lungs. Nothing. They weren't trying hard enough. "Do something." Olivia's voice cracked as she tried to shove forward. "Olivia. Olivia." She didn't care who was speaking. Didn't care that they were trying to hold her back. Didn't care that her own body was torn, broken, bleeding. The only thing that mattered was Ethan wasn't breathing. Another compression. Another breath. Then, a miracle. Ethan's body jerked violently, a sharp gasp ripping from his throat. The medics reacted instantly, tilting his head, stabilizing him as he choked on a ragged, shuddering breath. Relief crashed into Olivia so hard it stole what was left of her strength. A sob tore from her lips, her body sagging as her vision blurred completely. He was alive. He was breathing. But as they loaded him onto the stretcher, as the paramedics barked out vitals and the sirens screamed in the distance, Olivia knew this wasn't over. Not even close. The hospital was a blur of fluorescent lights and frantic voices. Olivia barely remembered the ride there, just the sound of sirens screaming in her ears, the cold press of an oxygen mask against her face, and the sight of Ethan lying so still on the stretcher beside her. His hand had been cold when she touched it. Too cold. Now, she sat in the waiting room, motionless, hollow, wrapped in a blanket someone had thrown over her shoulders. Blood from a gash on her forehead had dried against her skin, but she didn't feel it. Her body was numb, her mind trapped in a loop of the same horrifying image. Ethan slipping from her grasp, falling, disappearing. Caleb sat beside her, his leg bouncing restlessly. He hadn't said much, just kept glancing toward the doors that led to the trauma unit, waiting for news. Every few minutes he would look at Olivia like he wanted to say something, but he never did. What was there to say? She didn't know how much time had passed before a doctor finally appeared, his expression unreadable. Olivia surged to her feet, her heart in her throat. "Is he?" Her voice cracked before she could finish the sentence. The doctor gave a reassuring nod. "He's alive." The breath that had been strangled in her chest finally escaped in a broken sob. She covered her mouth, her entire body shaking. "But," the doctor continued, his voice gentler now, "he sustained significant injuries. a fractured rib, a deep laceration to his head, and, he hesitated, some oxygen deprivation from nearly drowning. He's unconscious for now, but we're monitoring him closely. Olivia nodded, barely processing anything beyond the fact that Ethan was still here. "Can I see him?" she asked, her voice raw. The doctor studied her, taking in the blood staining her dress, the bruises along her arms, the sheer exhaustion carved into every inch of her face. Then, finally, he nodded. "This way." Olivia followed him through the sterile white halls, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if she were walking toward something she wasn't ready to face. Then, they reached his room. The moment she saw him, her breath hitched painfully. Ethan lay against stark white sheets, his face pale against the contrast. Bandages wrapped around his forehead, an IV was threaded into his arm, and the steady beep, 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 beep of the heart monitor was the only sound breaking the silence. He looked so different, so fragile, in a way she had never seen before. Tears blurred her vision as she moved to his bedside. Slowly, she reached out, her fingers brushing against his hand, the same hand that had once held hers so tightly, that had grasped for her even as he was falling. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "I'm right here." But Ethan didn't stir. She sank into the chair beside him, her fingers curling around his hand. A sob silently shook her chest, but she refused to let it escape. Because she had to be strong. For him. The door creaked open, and Caleb stepped inside. His eyes flickered to Ethan, then to Olivia. "You should get checked out, Liv," he murmured. "You're hurt too." She shook her head, gripping Ethan's hand tighter. "I'm not leaving." Caleb sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "At least let them clean you up." "Not yet." Her voice was quiet but firm. Silence stretched between them. Then, softly, Caleb said, "They're investigating the crash." Olivia went still. Her gaze lifted to meet his, a storm brewing in her eyes. He hesitated. "They're saying it wasn't just an accident." Her blood turned to ice. Caleb shifted uncomfortably. Something about the helicopter's last maintenance report not matching the flight records. And the way the rotor failed. He exhaled sharply. "They think it was tampered with." Olivia's breath caught. She looked back at Ethan, broken, unconscious, barely clinging to life. And then, for the first time since the crash, her grief hardened into something else. Rage. Because if this wasn't an accident, then someone had done this. Someone had tried to kill them. And she would find out who. The weight of Caleb's words settled over Olivia like a suffocating fog. Tampered. The helicopter hadn't just failed. It had been sabotaged. She sat frozen, Ethan's lifeless hand still clutched in hers, her mind racing in 100 different directions. Every memory of that night replayed in sharp, excruciating detail. The flickering warning lights, the pilot's panicked voice, the sudden, violent loss of control. This hadn't been bad luck. It had been intentional. A slow, burning heat spread through her chest. Someone had tried to kill them. Her grip on Ethan's hand tightened. "Do they know who?" she asked, her voice eerily calm. Caleb hesitated. "No, but they're investigating. The FAA is already involved, and the police are looking into everyone who had access to the helicopter before takeoff." His gaze flickered, watching her carefully. "Liv, if someone did this, they're dangerous." She barely heard him. Her mind was already working, already pulling apart every moment leading up to the crash. Jonathan Carter. Her father had been too calm that night, too careful with his words. "Take care of her," The way he had placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, the way he had arranged the flight without warning. It was too perfect. The helicopter had been his gift, and now Ethan was lying in a hospital bed, barely alive. A sharp breath left her lips. I need to talk to him. Caleb's brows furrowed. What? My father, she said, standing abruptly. A sudden movement made her vision spin. But she ignored it. Caleb reached for her arm. Olivia, you're not thinking straight. We don't even know if it was him. She ripped away from his grasp. Don't we? Caleb hesitated. He knew her father as well as she did. Knew exactly what Jonathan Carter was capable of. But before he could stop her, she was already moving. She didn't bother calling ahead. She didn't care if it was late. She needed answers. And she wasn't waiting. The Carter estate was bathed in golden light when she arrived, the kind of opulence that had once felt normal to her. Now, it made her stomach turn. The guards at the gate let her through without hesitation, and when she pushed open the heavy double doors, she found her father exactly where she expected him. In his study, a glass of whiskey in hand, waiting for her. His eyes flicked up, unsurprised as she stepped inside. Olivia slammed the door behind her. Cut the bullshit, she snapped. Did you do it? Jonathan's expression didn't change. He took a measured sip of whiskey before setting the glass down with a soft clink. I don't know what you mean. Her hands curled into fists. The helicopter. The gift. Did you tamper with it? Silence. Then, her father sighed, running a hand along the edge of his desk. You're being emotional. Olivia let out a hollow laugh, shaking with rage. Ethan almost died. Her voice cracked, raw with the weight of her grief. If he doesn't wake up... She stopped herself, swallowing hard. If you had anything to do with this, I swear... Jonathan leaned forward, his expression suddenly cold, unreadable.
What would you do, Olivia?
A shiver rippled down her spine. For the first time, she wasn't looking at her father. She was looking at the man he truly was. She knew without a doubt that he was responsible. Maybe he hadn't pulled the wires himself. But he had given the order. And he felt no remorse. Her throat tightened. You did this. Jonathan sighed again, almost bored. I did what I had to do. A sharp, shaking breath left her lips. You tried to kill him. His gaze hardened. I tried to protect you. The room spun. From what? She whispered. Her father stood, rounding the desk until he was in front of her, until he was close enough that she could see the ruthless certainty in his eyes. From making the worst mistake of your life. Her stomach lurched. He truly believed that. He had tried to kill Ethan, had nearly killed her, because he thought he was saving her. For the first time in her life, she hated him. Her voice came out low, unshaken. Final. You're going to pay for this. Jonathan smirked, unfazed. You won't do anything. She held his gaze. Watch me. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. She wasn't his daughter anymore. She was his enemy. The lesson behind the story. Life is unpredictable. One moment, we believe we have everything. A future mapped out, love that feels unshakable, and dreams that seem within reach. The next, everything crumbles beneath us, leaving nothing but questions, grief, and the harsh truth that not everyone wants to see us happy. Olivia and Ethan's story is more than just a tragedy. It's a reminder of how fragile life is, how quickly it can be stolen, and how the people we trust the most can sometimes be the ones who betray us. The greatest lesson here: never take a moment for granted. If you love someone, tell them. If you have a dream, chase it. If you sense danger, listen to your instincts, because sometimes we don't get second chances. This story also teaches us about resilience and truth. Olivia could have let grief consume her. She could have allowed fear to silence her. Instead, she chose to fight. For love, for justice, for herself. And that's what true strength looks like. Not avoiding pain, but confronting it. So let this be a reminder. Hold on to what matters. Protect what you love. And never let anyone dictate the course of your life. Now I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Because sometimes fiction holds the most powerful truths.